From my own perspective, I can't overestimate how important the Voyager has been. It managed to satisfy any Minimoog need I had, and I see it everywhere I go, and I've always got one in backup just in case something might happen, because it's part of every project I've ever done. The end. Yeah, I'm Trent Reznor. I have a group, 9 Inch Nails, and I do other things, but... Nine Inch Nails put their first record out very end of '89. We just toured relentlessly for the next 2 years, and then our second proper album, Downward Spiral, kind of, to everyone's amazement, particularly mine, commercially took off. We started a tour playing theaters, and we ended the tour playing arenas sold out. It was pretty wild, kind of roller coaster ride. And the way I remember it, somewhere in that process, Bob Moog's backstage, and it was a treat to actually meet somebody that was the driving force behind something that very much shaped how I view and create music. To get my story, you have to understand where I came from, which is rural Pennsylvania in the middle of nowhere, in a time long before the internet, outside the realm of college radio airwaves. And I started taking piano lessons when I was 5 years old, and I had a natural kind of feel for it, and I really enjoyed playing keyboards. I got pretty good at it. The dream back then, because I grew up in a modest family, I wanted to get a synthesizer. That seemed like the perfect marriage of my interests, which was music, keyboards, but also electronics and what was happening in the primitive world of computers. And the first synth I ever got, and that was the greatest day of my life at the time, was the Moog Prodigy. It was pretty new. There was a music store in Youngstown, Ohio, New York Music, and through begging and chore doing, my grandparents bought that synth for me. And that was really the huge turning point. I knew that thing inside and out, and it just felt musical. It didn't have anything to compare it to in the world of synths, but it was deeply satisfying, and it felt like a musical instrument, not just a collection of circuitry in a box. I reached a point, early 20s, where I decided to just give up everything else and go in a room and try to realize what I had to say. I knew I had something to say. I was afraid what I had to say wouldn't be good. I knew if your music was good or bad, but I didn't know what mine was, because I was afraid to write music to find out if it sucked. And I got a job in a studio doing the jobs nobody else wanted to do, from toilet cleaning to, let's put it this way, bad stuff nobody wants to do. But I was able to sit in a room and teach myself some degree of engineering, and I had the ability to kind of work on my own music back then. I managed to come out of that with a PPG 2.3, an old Minimoog that I'd found with a MIDI retrofit, and Oberheim expander. And that was my rig that felt like it could cover all the bases at the time. My entire musical career, from the first demos of Brigade Machine through the present, has always had, really the only constant has been Moog in one form or another. The Minimoog, what I think is genius about it, is it may not have every modulation possibility imagined. It doesn't have this week's form of synthesis in there. But what it does have right is the recipe of components in there feel like an instrument. And it has its own identity, it feels musical. What you can do, it's hard to make it sound bad. It's elevated from a box with circuits in it and paint on the outside to an instrument that has a personality and invites you to not only to learn how it works, but how to play it. And it feels expressive, and it doesn't feel like this week's model. It feels like a thing, Any synth bass that's ever been on Pretty Hay Machine was Minimoog, and it was just light years beyond anything else I had. In my personal arsenal, I had an expander that was interesting to do elaborate modulations and, for stranger sounds and more interesting kind of complex things that had a much different sound and the different Oberheim filters in that particular unit were good for certain things, but when you wanted warmth or you wanted it to feel organic, the emotional connection that always came out of the Minimoog, just touching the key. And this was doing battle with tune drifting and the clumsy MIDI implementation and envelopes that I wish behaved a little bit differently, but the sound itself was unmatched then and remains that way. I was excited to hear that a modern version of this instrument that was revered and loved by me was coming out that wasn't compromised. That I didn't mind the higher price tag, but what I wanted was an uncompromising vision of that. I welcome the stability of tuning, the better implementation of MIDI and et cetera, and modulation capabilities, programmability. And I was relieved when I heard it to say, it sounds, I couldn't tell the difference. I don't feel like I'm giving anything up, and I'm gaining a lot by the Voyager. So as I recall, around when that was launched, the trend had continued with other manufacturers of everything has more stuff and is built cheaper, and we compromised on the filter because it was, things that just turn it into instantly being a useless instrument. It was nice to see that there was still excellence as the goal. Felt that way as a consumer. Felt that way unwrapping it and playing it and saying, I can't wait to get to know this instrument, and be part of my world. When we start a new album, and we is generally Atticus and myself, we kind of work on everything together. What we'll initially do is, rather than just repeat ourselves and see what, reach for the same thing because it does the same thing and we know that's going to do that and it's easy to do that, we'll think about, what are we trying to accomplish here? In the case of Hesitation Marks, what was interesting to us was grooves, making things feel like a performance rather than everything being quantized and right, which is hard not to do in today's world of everything just works and fits together. And we set up, this table was twice as big and it was filled with old drum machines and a mixer, no sync between that and this, and we just tap tempo and try to start drum machines in time and get feels and record stuff and listen. But in Hesitation Marks, a lot of the tracks were started by that kind of collage of thing process and working around imperfections and anomalies. The Voyager would be one of the first things that end up anchoring those pieces together that we get out. I know that we went through that with Copyeva, was experimenting with sequences that loop and don't loop in 4/4 over top of very rich drum beats with that, with the bass on that and the synth on that, all Voyager. And that's pretty much the root of that song. The transition I made into film, which I was very intimidated because I thought, I don't know this process, it's got to be different writing to picture than it is writing a song, And it is different, and it wasn't incredibly smooth, but for the most part it felt pretty natural because really what I was doing was just acting as a conduit between how do I emotionally express something that fits that palette instead of this palette. I'm relying more on the tools around me, how I emotionally respond to them, versus the specs or every possible option in depth. And I have the luxury of having a great room like this filled with cool stuff in it, that I have a pretty good working knowledge of how each piece makes me feel. And as that thing comes up, if I kind of want to get this feeling out, and I think it should feel this way, and it should feel a little insecure, and it should be a little warbly, but it shouldn't feel happy, and it should be a little bit pissed off. What is that? And the Voyager is always something that can achieve a lot of those things, particularly expressiveness. You learn to realize how difficult it must be as a designer to put the right stuff in there, in the right box, with the right feel, because it doesn't matter what it feels like, it looks like, and what that knob feels like, and that's an achievement, to elevate it, to give it life, rather than just it's a blueprint that someone did a nice job engineering. It feels like something that I want to sit down and engage with it, because I'm not just writing code on it, it's translating what an instrument does. It translates your emotions to something that someone else might experience and relate to. And I think it does a great job of that. It is the archetype of what, to me, what a synthesizer is and should be. There's never a time when there's not one of them in the room, because it's part of the vocabulary of how I arrange music. And it's probably, in fact, it is the only thing that's been there all the time in one form or another. Because it just, it does a thing that nothing else does. And I don't want to not have that,